The fluorescent lights hummed overhead at 6:56 a.m., casting everything in that particular shade of white that made blood look black and skin look gray. Katie Morrison pushed through the ER doors of Mercy General with her shift badge already clipped to her scrubs, moving past the intake desk without acknowledging the chaos blooming behind it, a drunk in Bay 3 yelling about his ribs, a mother in the waiting area holding a child's wrapped hand, the usual Saturday morning wreckage of a city that never really sleeps. She didn't break stride. Her hands were steady as she moved deeper into the ward, past the nurses' station where the day shift was still filing in, their voices rising in that particular exhausted harmony of people who'd learned to communicate in shorthand and dark humor. The antiseptic smell, that sharp chemical bite that never quite covered the underneath smell of illness and sweat, was already thick in the recycled air. Katie had smelled worse. She'd smelled much worse. But nobody here knew that. She'd been a nurse at Mercy General for 4 years, and in those 4 years she'd become the kind of invisible that required actual skill to maintain. Not invisible because she was forgettable, she caught medication errors that other nurses missed, moved with a precision in crisis that made the younger staff follow her lead without thinking about why they were following, but invisible in the way that people with authority preferred. She showed up, did her work, didn't ask for recognition, and most importantly, didn't challenge the order of things. The attending physicians mostly didn't register her presence until she had information they needed. The residents learned quickly not to take shortcuts when she was in the room. Even the patient seemed to calm when she was near, as if they could sense that her hands had held worse situations than theirs and found them manageable. But nobody asked her why. Before Mercy General, there had been 12 years of something else. 12 years of a different kind of uniform, different rhythms, different reasons for needing to keep hands steady. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Ann Morrison of the United States Coast Guard, stationed in San Diego, 3 deployments to the Middle East that she'd learned not to think about in linear ways. Ramadi had a way of fragmenting time, breaking it into before moments and after moments, and the after moments had a tendency to arrive without warning. Loud noises. The smell of diesel fuel. The weight of a child who weighed almost nothing, bleeding onto her uniform while she ran through a collapsed housing unit with rounds snapping overhead like angry insects. That was the particular moment that had made her understand that she needed to not be Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Ann Morrison anymore. She needed to be someone who could hold a stethoscope without her hands remembering things. Someone who could work in an ER without the fluorescent lights triggering the part of her brain that was still convinced it was under fire. So 4 years ago, using the separation paperwork that cited PTSD without elaboration, using a reference agency that asked no questions about the employment gap, using her married name and a carefully constructed explanation about wanting a fresh start, Katie Morrison had become just Katie Morrison. Nurse. Competent, reliable, and thoroughly unremarkable to anyone whose authority depended on hierarchy. She was checking the night shift report when the ambulance radio crackled to life. The voice on the dispatch was clipped, professional, incoming from a boating accident on the bay, male, approximately 60 years old, unconscious but breathing, ETA for minutes. She made note of it the way she made note of everything, a small corner of her attention that stayed operational even while her hands were moving through other tasks. Bay 1 was being cleared. Dr. Sterling's voice could already be heard from somewhere deeper in the department, that particular tone of authority that didn't require him to be present to fill a room. The ambulance doors burst open at 6:51 a.m., and the paramedics wheeled in a man in his early 60s, his face the color of wet concrete, his breathing shallow and labored even with the oxygen mask covering half his face. The crew was efficient, they'd given him 2 rounds of fluids, checked his glucose, radioed ahead with a GCS of 13. He was soaked through, his expensive-looking sailing jacket dripping salt water onto the stretcher, and as the team transferred him to Bay 1, Katie moved in with automatic precision, her hands already reaching for the 4 setup, already assessing. It was the jacket that caught her attention. Most patients came through stripped of dignity and personal effects, their clothes bagged up and pushed aside. But this man's jacket hadn't been fully removed yet, and as Katie reached to help the paramedics, she caught something that made her movement stutter for just a fraction of a second, the kind of stutter that only happened when her nervous system recognized something her conscious mind hadn't processed yet. Sewn inside the jacket lining, just barely visible where the shoulder seam had started to separate, was a patch. Faded. Old. The kind of unit patch that didn't exist anymore because the unit had been redesignated, reorganized, folded into the larger structure of the institution that owned it. The patch from her squadron. The squadron she'd served with in Ramadi. The squadron where she'd learned that her hands were good at keeping people alive and her mind was not good at living with that knowledge. Katie's breathing shifted. Just once. Just barely perceptible. Her hands continued moving, pulling the 4 kit, checking the man's pupils, maintaining the script that had kept her safe for 4 years. But her eyes had gone somewhere else for a moment. Back to a street in Fallujah where the houses all looked the same and she was running toward a sound that shouldn't have been a sound because it was a child's cry and children weren't supposed to be in combat zones but they were, they always were, and this one had been caught in the collapse of a building that had been deliberately targeted by someone who was trying to kill her and the 17 other sailors and Marines who'd been moving through that neighborhood on a security sweep. She reached down to adjust the patch, just for a second, her fingers trembling in a way she couldn't quite control. The man's jacket shifted. The patch disappeared back into the lining. And that was when she felt the presence in the room change, felt the particular quality of attention that meant someone was watching. Not the paramedics. Not the rest of the team. Someone else. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway of Bay 1, his arms crossed, his expression that particular blend of casual observation and careful calculation that Katie had learned to recognize over 4 years of careful invisibility. He was in his early 50s, with the kind of salt and pepper hair that he clearly spent money on maintaining, and the kind of bearing that came from being the type of man who'd never had to work very hard to be taken seriously. His board connections had made him the ER director at Mercy General 5 years ago, and his network had been keeping him untouchable ever since. He was looking at Katie's trembling hands. He was looking at her face. He was looking at the moment where she'd let the mask slip, where she'd stopped being the invisible nurse and become something else entirely, someone who recognized something in this unconscious man that mattered enough to break her composure. And Katie, still holding the 4 kit, still maintaining her breathing, still running through the protocol that was supposed to keep her hidden, understood in that moment with perfect clarity that she'd made a mistake. That she'd let something show. That she'd given Dr. Sterling the one thing he'd been waiting for all along, evidence that she wasn't quite what she claimed to be, that there was something underneath the quiet competence that didn't fit the story she'd constructed. The room went dead silent except for the beep of the monitors and the hiss of oxygen flowing. "Let's get him stable," Katie said, her voice level and precise, the voice of someone who'd given 1,000 orders and expected them to be followed. "Continuous cardiac monitoring. Type and cross-match for 4 units. I need a full trauma panel and a chest X-ray to rule out pneumothorax." She didn't look at Dr. Sterling again. But she could feel him watching her. Calculating. And that was when she understood that her safe for years were about to become considerably more complicated. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the silence of Commander Hartley's room like a scalpel finding the exact vein he wanted to bleed. Katie had been checking the monitor, verifying that O2 sat was holding steady at 94%, when Sterling pushed through the door with the kind of theatrical urgency that announced his presence before his words did. His eyes landed on her, then swept across to Hartley's wife seated in the corner chair, then back to Katie with the satisfied smile of a man who had just noticed something he could use. "Nurse Morrison," he said, his tone pitched to make her name sound like a diagnosis. "Perhaps you could explain why you were examining this gentleman's personal belongings." Katie's hand stilled on the 4 line. She did not look up. 12 years of training told her exactly what was happening, the setup, the audience, the trap already snapped around her ankle. She had made a single mistake, checking the jacket lining for a medical alert bracelet or identification, standard protocol, except her hands had lingered on the faded unit patch for 4 seconds longer than protocol required. Those 4 seconds were now a weapon. "Checking for ID, doctor," Katie said, her voice steady as a nurse checking a box on a chart. "Standard intake procedure." "Standard," Sterling repeated, turning to face Hartley's wife directly. His posture shifted, shoulders back, chin elevated, every molecule of his body language broadcasting authority and concern. He was a maestro conducting a symphony of humiliation, and Katie was the instrument he intended to break. "Mrs. Hartley, did this nurse explain why she was going through your husband's clothing while he was unconscious?" Mrs. Hartley's face tightened. She looked toward Katie, then back to Sterling, confusion crossing her features like a shadow. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "She was just—" Mrs. Hartley began. "Inappropriate familiarity with a patient's personal property creates liability concerns," Sterling continued, speaking over the woman's attempted defense as if she had said nothing. "It's a boundary violation. We're very careful about those things here at Mercy General. Very careful indeed." He turned back to Katie, and his smile widened, the expression of a predator who had successfully isolated its prey from the herd. "I trust you understand the seriousness of this conduct." Katie's jaw tightened for exactly one beat. She could see Mrs. Hartley's expression shifting from confusion to something darker, suspicion, maybe, or doubt. The patch meant nothing to Sterling. It was just a tool. But to Katie, that patch was the screaming of mortar fire at 2 in the morning, the weight of a bleeding 6-year-old against her chest, the reason she had spent 8 years hiding in plain sight in a San Diego emergency department. Her hands remained steady on the fall line. "I'll be more careful," Katie said, and the flatness of her voice, the complete absence of defensiveness, seemed to frustrate Sterling more than anger would have. He lingered for another moment, as if disappointed by her refusal to crumble, then turned to leave with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had drawn first blood. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room was half full at 2:58 in the afternoon. 3 nurses were restocking the coffee station, 2 nursing assistants were sitting at the table reviewing charts, and 1 resident was eating a sandwich that smelled like turkey and regret. Katie pushed through the door, her badge still clipped to her scrubs, and headed directly for the refrigerator. She needed 3 minutes of quiet to reset her nervous system back to baseline. She had trained for worse than Sterling. She could absorb this. The moment she sat down at the table with her lunch, the break room experienced what could only be described as a synchronized evacuation. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was worse than both of those things. It was systematic and complete. One nurse stood up, mentioned something about checking on a patient. The other stood up, remembered she needed to grab supplies from the stockroom. The resident swallowed his sandwich hard and said something about needing to write a note. Within 90 seconds, Katie was alone at the table with a plastic container of rice and grilled chicken that suddenly tasted like ash. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical rhythm. And Katie sat motionless, her fork resting on the edge of her container, understanding exactly what Sterling had just orchestrated. It wasn't the public humiliation that would destroy her. It was the silence that followed. It was being made invisible while sitting in plain sight. It was the message delivered without words, "You are contagious." She finished her lunch anyway. Every single bite. Because she had learned long ago that showing discomfort was the same as showing weakness, and showing weakness was how predators identified which prey to attack next. The write-up was posted on the unit board at 4:22 in the afternoon, a laminated page printed in Arial 12-point font with the casual cruelty of institutional authority. Katie found it while restocking the medication cart, reading it once, then again, and then a third time to confirm that Sterling had managed to transform her attempt to help into clinical ammunition. Incident report, confidential. Name, Katie Morrison, RN. Date of incident, today's date. Incident type, unprofessional conduct, boundary violation. 2 days crawled past like wounded animals. The incident report had circulated through Mercy General's ER like a contagion, Sterling's word spreading faster than any bacteria cultures could ever grow. Katie moved through her shifts with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that survival meant being invisible. She restocked medication carts. She turned patients. She documented vitals in crisp, clinical language that revealed nothing about the war happening inside her chest. Sterling watched her constantly now. From the nursing station, from the doctor's lounge, his eyes tracking her movements with the hunger of a predator who had tasted blood and wanted more. He'd made 3 phone calls to the temp agency already. Katie had overheard the administrative assistant whispering about it in the break room before everyone suddenly remembered they had tasks elsewhere. He was building something. A case. A reason. A path to the final blow. Commander Hartley remained in Bay 4, stable on day 2 post-admission. His wife sat beside him in a chair that had seen too many vigils, holding his hand while he drifted in and out of the morphine haze that passed for comfort after a boating collision had crushed 3 ribs and cracked his sternum. Katie had checked on him twice during her shift, professional and distant, the way she checked on all her patients now. No connection. No recognition. Just the clinical distance that kept her safe. At 2:13 p.m., the pulse oximeter above Hartley's bed began to drift downward. The beeping pattern shifted from a steady rhythm into something more urgent, closer together, climbing toward the alarm threshold. Katie was 4 beds away, changing a dressing on a laceration, when she heard it. Not the beeping itself, but the quality of the beeping. The pattern of oxygen desaturation. Not gradual. Not steady. A sudden drop. Something was wrong. Something was acutely, catastrophically wrong. She moved without thinking. Her hands finished securing the dressing. She stood. She walked toward Bay 4 with the same measured pace she used for every task, but her eyes had already catalogued what she needed. The 14-gauge angiocath needle. The alcohol prep pads. The exact location, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The resident on duty, a third-year named Chen, was still reviewing the monitor when Katie arrived. Hartley's oxygen saturation was 68 and dropping. His lips had taken on the blue-gray pallor of hypoxia. His breathing had become rapid, panicked, shallow, the terrified gasping of a drowning man who had forgotten he was supposed to be lying in a hospital bed. Tension pneumothorax, Katie said. It wasn't a question. Chen's eyes widened. He reached for his phone. I need to call. No time. Katie was already opening the angiocath tray. Her hands moved with the fluid economy of someone who had performed this procedure not in training simulations but in actual field conditions, where hesitation cost lives. He's got maybe 90 seconds before he goes into cardiac arrest. Sterling appeared at the edge of the bay like a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Nurse Morrison, step back. This is a physician-directed protocol. She didn't stop. The alcohol pad had already touched Hartley's skin, cold and sharp with its chemical bite. She palpated the ribs, 1, 2. The second intercostal space. The thin cartilaginous gap between them felt exactly the way she remembered it, and that was the problem. That was the thing she had been running from for 8 years. The memory of hands, not her hands, but hands like hers, steady enough to do this in the dark, under fire, while screaming men bled into the sand. I said stop. Sterling's voice was louder now. Frantic. He didn't move closer. He didn't take her place at the bedside. His hand stayed at his sides, curled into fists that were all fury and no action. This requires physician authorization. The needle went in. Not the slow, careful insertion that textbooks described, but the confident puncture of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much pressure the human body required. The hiss came immediately, that unmistakable, haunting sound of air escaping, the sound that meant lungs that had been collapsing now had room to expand again. Katie's eyes flicked to the monitor. O2 sat climbing. 68 to 72. 1 breath. 2. 72 to 79. The gasping slowed. Hartley's lips still held their blue tint, but his chest was moving now, actually moving, drawing in air instead of the vacuum that had nearly killed him. 79 to 85. The pressure in the bay shifted. Subtle. Invisible to anyone who hadn't spent time around people trained to move in synchronized lethal precision. But it was there, the tension between Sterling's outrage and Katie's absolute command of the scene. 88 to 92. Stable, she said quietly. She was holding the needle in place, her other hand already reaching for the tape to secure it. Someone get a chest tube kit. He'll need a formal procedure in the OR, but this buys time. The room had stopped breathing. Chen stared at her like she had just materialized from another dimension. A nurse 2 beds over had her hand frozen above a medication cart. Even Sterling had gone very still, his mouth open on words that didn't come. Katie didn't look at any of them. She was focused entirely on Hartley, on the monitor readings, on the rise and fall of his chest. On the fact that he was alive. That the man who had been drowning in his own collapsed lung 30 seconds ago was now oxygenating at 94%, climbing steadily toward normal. Where did you learn that? Sterling's voice had lost its authority. It sounded small now. Fractured. You're not authorized to. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, Katie said. She might have been explaining how to change a bed. Triage protocol for immediate life threat. O2 SATs were critically low. The words had slipped out without thinking. Triage protocol. Not ER protocol. Not hospital protocol. That phrasing belonged to a different world. A world with radio communications and landing zones and decisions made in seconds because the next breath might never come. Sterling's face had gone white. Not from anger now, but from something else. Something like recognition. Something like fear. The next seconds unfolded in controlled chaos. A team materialized from the as organized efficiency, the attending physician, the surgical resident, the respiratory tech with the chest tube kit. They moved around Katie with a careful navigation of people who had just witnessed something that didn't fit into any of their standard protocols. She stepped back from the bedside, her work complete, the angiocath secured and Hartley's oxygen level stable and holding strong at 95%. Sterling had already disappeared. Katie walked to the medication cart and resumed her restocking. Her hands were perfectly steady. No tremor. No adrenaline shake. Just the methodical placement of syringes back into their designated slots, each action precise and measured and exactly what you would expect from a nurse who had never been anything more than a nurse. But something had shifted. Someone, probably Chen, probably the respiratory therapist who had looked at her with new questions forming behind his eyes, had seen something in those 90 seconds that didn't match the narrative Sterling had been building. The calm. The decisiveness. The exact knowledge of where the needle needed to go and how much pressure it needed to meet resistance. The kind of knowledge that didn't come from textbooks or orientation videos. The kind of knowledge that came from field medicine. Combat medicine. The kind of medicine practiced by people trained to make impossible decisions under impossible conditions. As Katie slid the final tray of syringes into place, she felt the weight of it settling against her like a physical thing. Sterling was going to do something desperate now. Not because of protocol violations anymore. Not because she had corrected his medication errors or challenged his authority. Because she had just revealed something in front of a room full of witnesses, and there was no policy in the world that would let him explain it away. She had saved a man's life in 90 seconds using a procedure that required the kind of muscle memory only military medics possessed. What happened next would be the real reckoning. The monitor beeped steady as the needle withdrew. Sinus rhythm. Oxygen climbing from 68 to 92. Commander Hartley's chest rose with actual breath, not the mechanical desperation of moments before. The room exhaled. Dr. Sterling stood frozen by the doorway, his hands still at his sides. He had not moved. Had not ordered anyone to move. Had not done anything except watch a senior chief petty officer perform a procedure that required muscle memory he could not explain, authority he could not challenge, and precision that made every certification on his wall look like a participation trophy. Katie stepped back from the bed. She did not look at him. She never looked at him. She peeled off her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the smallest action would now be scrutinized, weaponized, transformed into evidence. The silence held exactly 3 seconds. Then Sterling's phone was already in his hand. He stepped into the hallway, and Katie heard the first call activate before the ER doors swung closed behind him. She was still at Hartley's bedside when Sterling's voice carried through the thin walls, not angry, not urgent, but the particular smooth tone of a man activating a network he had spent years cultivating. "Richard, I know you're in the middle of racquetball, but we have a significant liability issue at Mercy General." Sterling's voice moved down the corridor. "Our ER staff are executing procedures outside physician supervision. Specifically, an unauthorized needle decompression performed by a nurse with no documented training in surgical intervention." Katie's hands moved through the standard post-procedure checklist. "Check the dressing. Verify the tube placement. Document the vital signs." The work steadied her. The work was always real. "I'll have risk management on this by end of business," Sterling continued, and she heard him descending the stairs now, the phone pressed tight against his ear. "I'm concerned this individual may have fabricated credentials. We should pull her file from the temp agency before she poisoned someone else's family." The machinery hummed its constant rhythm. Ventilator. Monitor. For pump. The sounds that had become her oxygen. By 2:14 p.m., the outside risk management team had arrived, 3 people in dark blazers carrying tablets and the particular air of consultants who billed by the hour and optimized for termination. They were met by Sterling in his office, and Katie watched from the nurse's station as he handed them a folder thick enough to contain an entire career's worth of accumulated suspicion. She caught fragments as they moved through the ER. Boundary violations. Unsupervised emergency procedures. Pattern of insubordination. Possible credential fraud. The director of risk management was a woman with silver hair and the kind of smile that appeared in depositions. She reviewed the documentation Sterling had compiled, incident reports he must have been drafting for weeks, each one a small brick in a wall designed to look like professional concern rather than personal vendetta. "We'll need to interview staff," the woman said, her pen moving across her tablet. "Document the extent of the protocol violation. Build a discharge case that protects the hospital from litigation." Sterling nodded. He was very good at this. He had built his entire career on being very good at this. Katie continued her shift. She moved between patients with the same careful efficiency that had carried her through 12 years of active duty, through Ramadi, through everything that came after. She did not defend herself. She did not call her union rep, she did not make a scene. She simply worked, the way she had been trained to work, with focus that excluded everything except the immediate task, the immediate patient, the next breath. At 4:56 p.m., Sterling appeared at her station with security standing behind him. 2 officers in dark uniforms, their utility belts heavy with authority. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," Sterling said. His voice carried enough volume that 3 nurses within earshot froze mid-task. "You are to surrender your badge, collect your personal belongings from your locker, and leave the premises. Security will accompany you." Katie did not move immediately. She finished entering the medication she had been documenting. She hit save. Only then did she look up at him. One measured breath. Her eyes met his for exactly the duration of a heartbeat, and she said, "Of course, doctor," with a kind of quiet that made several nurses turn to look at her. The locker room was empty. She had never left photographs there, never posted pictures of family or vacation destinations, never built the small shrine that nurses typically constructed around their workspace. She had one personal item, a water bottle with a faded Coast Guard insignia, and she placed it in the cardboard box security handed her. Her badge landed on the locker room bench with a soft click. The lanyard had left a groove in her scrubs. Her hands shook too badly to carry her coffee mug, so she left it on the shelf. 3-year-old ceramic. Mercy General's logo. She stared at it for 6 seconds, then turned away. Sterling watched from his office window as security escorted her toward the parking garage. She could feel his satisfaction pressing against the glass like heat from a furnace. She did not look back. That evening, the rain came down in sheets that hammered the pavement like applause. Katie stood at Fort Rosecrans, at the grave marker that bore the name Marcus James Morrison, and the rain soaked through her jacket, through her scrubs, down to the skin beneath. Her terminated badge was still in her pocket, a thin piece of plastic that had defined her days and meant nothing. She knelt on the wet grass. "I failed again, Marcus," she whispered. "I tried to just be normal, and I failed." The words dissolved into the sound of rain. She held the faded unit patch in her other hand, the one she had kept hidden inside her jacket lining for 8 years, the patch from her old squadron, from Ramadi, from before she had tried to bury everything that made her who she actually was. The cloth was thin enough that rain soaked through it. "I served as a senior chief petty officer for 12 years. I saved lives. I held things together when everything was falling apart. Then I came here and I tried to be invisible, and it wasn't enough. Sterling saw what I was the moment I looked at that patch. I couldn't hide it. I couldn't hide any of it." The rain kept falling. The city lights reflected off wet stone. She almost threw the patch into the grass. Her hand was already rising, the cloth already leaving her fingers, when something stopped her. Not sentiment. Not nostalgia. Something deeper than that, the recognition that the patch represented not her failure but her truth, and that burying truth was what had brought her to this moment in the first place. She closed her hand around it instead. The drive from Fort Rosecrans took 22 minutes. Katie sat in her car in the Mercy General parking garage on level B3, watching the shadows of other cars pass through the darkness. Her phone had no messages. No calls. No one from the hospital had contacted her to explain what Sterling had told them, what story he had constructed in those hours while she was still working, still believing that she could simply be a nurse and nothing more. She was still there at 11:38 p.m. when she heard it. The sound was distant at first, a vibration in the air, a frequency that made her shoulders tense and her breathing change. She knew that sound. She had heard it in places where sky looked different and the risk of dying was measured in single-digit minutes. Helicopter rotors. More than one. Growing closer. Katie sat up in her seat. The sound intensified, moving toward the hospital, and she saw the glow first, navigation lights cutting through the rain, before the aircraft themselves appeared. 3 of them. Military configuration. Not news helicopters. Not medical transport. The rotor wash reached the parking garage and shook the concrete pillars. They were landing in the ambulance bay. 3 Black Hawk helicopters descended through the San Diego dawn like angels bearing judgment. The rotor wash shattered the quiet of the ambulance bay, scattering loose papers across the asphalt in violent spirals. Security lights flickered. Car alarms shrieked. And then the aircraft settled, their landing gear kissing concrete with the finality of a verdict. The ER doors burst open before the rotors even spun down. A Master Chief in dress blues walked through those doors the way drill sergeants walk, shoulders squared, eyes forward, presence that made the air pressure change. His chevrons caught the fluorescent light. His boots struck tile with percussion like a countdown. Every nurse in the emergency department stopped what they were doing. Monitors still beeped. Ventilators still wheezed. But human movement ceased. He stopped at the nurse's station. His voice came out like a tank idling in a garage, steady and immense. "I am looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the rain outside pattering against the windows like fingernails on glass. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dr. Sterling emerged from Trauma Bay 3, his face already flushed with the color of a man who suddenly understood he had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Katie was in the supply room restocking airways. She had not slept. Her hand still moved on muscle memory, 8mm tubes, 7.0 pediatric, 6.5 for small adults, the same sequence she had performed 10,000 times across 2 decades. The cardboard box with her belongings sat in her locker. Her ID badge was in her scrub pocket, the one Sterling had made her surrender at 3:16 p.m. yesterday, the one that now meant nothing. She heard the boots. She heard the silence. And then she heard a voice that made her entire body go still. Senior Chief. It came from Trauma Bay 4, where Commander Hartley had been resting. His voice cracked with recognition and something that sounded like gratitude, the kind of sound a man makes when he sees someone he thought was lost rising up from the dead. Senior Chief Morrison. Katie's hands stopped moving. The 7.0 endotracheal tube she was holding became very quiet and very heavy. She walked out of the supply room. The Master Chief's eyes found her immediately, the kind of recognition that transcends rank or time or distance. Commander Hartley was standing despite medical orders, his full line extending behind him like a tether he had broken. His eyes were locked on hers. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Senior Chief, he said again, and this time there was no question in it. She did not tremble. She did not flinch. She took one measured breath and stepped toward him. Commander. It was one word. It was everything. Dr. Sterling's face had drained of color. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He opened his mouth but no sound emerged because he was only now understanding that the woman he had destroyed, the woman whose employment records he had been forging at that very moment upstairs in Human Resources, was not a problem he had solved. She was a problem he had awakened. The Master Chief moved forward with the fluid precision of apex predators. Commander Hartley has been searching for you for 8 years. Coast Guard sent out 3 discreet inquiries. FBI ran a missing persons file when you declined to respond to official channels. You left no forwarding address. No contact information. No indication of where you were. Katie's hands did not shake. I needed to disappear. Understood, Senior Chief. The Master Chief's voice carried the weight of 100 operations he had conducted in silence. You did not disappear far enough. Behind him came others, Navy SEALs in civilian clothes, their bearing unmistakable, their eyes scanning the ER with the methodical precision of warriors cataloging threats. One of them, a lieutenant commander with the bearing of a man who had commanded Task Force 212 through 3 rotations in Helmand Province, stepped beside the Master Chief. I worked joint operations with Senior Chief Morrison in Ramadi. His voice was quiet. He was not speaking to Katie. He was speaking to everyone else. To the nurses. To the surgeons. To Dr. Sterling. 2004, the housing collapse near Jolan District. This woman earned 2 Bronze Stars pulling wounded out from under concrete and fire. She earned a Purple Heart when shrapnel took her left shoulder. And she earned the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for rushing back into a secondary collapse to retrieve civilians trapped beneath the rubble. He paused. His eyes moved across the ER staff like searchlights. Not a single person in this hospital has any idea who is standing in front of them. Dr. Sterling took a step backward. Katie's personnel file arrived by digital courier at 4:13 a.m. that morning, pulled from the Coast Guard archives, the restricted section, the classified division. 43 pages of commendations. Service record spanning 23 years and 8 months. 2 Bronze Stars, listed separately. Purple Heart. Navy and Marine Corps Medal. Advanced medical certifications. Expert-level surgical training. Marksmanship scores that exceeded Navy SEAL standards. And at the very bottom, a single line, medical discharge not taken. Voluntary separation. Psychological grounds. Ramadi PTSD. Approved for lifetime anonymity. She held the file with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the weight of all the things she had tried to bury finally being exposed to the light. The FBI agents arrived at 4:38 a.m. with federal credentials and voices that carried the authority of the Justice Department. They moved through Mercy General with the precision of people who had executed 100 warrants. One of them, a special agent named Reeves with the bearing of someone who had worked financial crimes for 18 years, placed a laptop on the ER counter and began scrolling through email chains. Dr. Sterling attempted to forge Katie Morrison's employment records beginning approximately 16 hours ago, Reeves said. His voice had the flat quality of testimony. He made 4 separate calls to the temp agency that placed her, requesting that they backdate negative performance reviews to justify her termination. When he could not reach the agency directly, he attempted to access their employee database using a phishing email. Reeves turned the laptop. On the screen were the emails, intercepted, time-stamped, damning. His calls triggered a federal alert when he tried to modify official employment records. The CFAA, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, makes this a felony. 20 years. Per count. Dr. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Those emails were, "I was simply trying to. You were committing fraud to destroy the career of a military officer," Reeves said. He did not raise his voice. His voice just got sharper. "One you tried to fire for doing her job. That officer saved Commander Hartley's life by performing a procedure you were too frozen to attempt. And you responded by trying to erase her from existence." The handcuffs came out at 4:41 a.m. They were stainless steel, the kind that reflect light. They caught the fluorescent glow as FBI agents approached Dr. Sterling, not roughly, not with drama, just with the mechanical efficiency of procedure. The clicks were very loud. One at each wrist. The sound of certainty. The sound of consequence. Dr. Sterling's voice climbed into ranges it should not have reached. He screamed about his reputation. His board seat. His lawyer. His connections. His brother-in-law the attorney. The entire ER watched him disintegrate. The surgeons who had defended him during his rise through hospital hierarchy suddenly became very interested in their coffee. The board members he had cultivated through 18 years of golf outings and fundraisers suddenly could not recall ever having met him. "I barely knew him," the chief of surgery said later, under deposition. "We had a professional relationship, nothing more," the hospital president claimed. The network Sterling had spent 2 decades constructing collapsed like a house in an earthquake. Katie watched him being escorted past the nurse's station. His dress shoes squeaked on the tile. His eyes met hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second she saw the precise moment a man realizes he has destroyed himself through his own hands. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She simply held his gaze with the quiet composure of someone who had survived far worse than this. 6 months later, Katie heard through a mutual acquaintance that Dr. Sterling was selling insurance from a folding table at a strip mall in El Cajon. The name tag read Steve. He flinched when anyone called him doctor. He made $42,000 a year, which was approximately what Mercy General had paid him per month in bonuses alone. The humiliation was complete not because it was severe, but because it was so utterly ordinary. The formal ceremony took place at San Diego Naval Base on a Thursday morning in October. The flagpole had been erected in the center of the parade ground. Rows of chairs faced a small platform. Military personnel filled the benches, Coast Guard officers, Navy admirals, SEAL team leaders whose names could not be said in public. Commander Hartley stood in his dress blues, his hand trembling slightly as he waited for his turn. Katie Morrison stood at attention in full dress uniform for the first time in 8 years. The fit was perfect because uniforms are designed to fit warriors of all shapes and sizes. The ribbons on her chest were a map of her history: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Navy and Marine Corps Medal, Good Conduct, Combat Action Ribbon, Coast Guard Medal, 6 more beneath. They caught the October sunlight. Commander Hartley approached her. His voice did not crack this time. It was steady. Professional. Clear as command. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rose Morrison, by order of the Secretary of the Navy, I am authorized to present you with the National Lifesaving Medal in recognition of extraordinary heroism in saving human life. He reached for the medal. It was heavy, bronze and ribbon, the weight of gratitude, the heft of recognition. He pinned it carefully to her uniform, above the other medals, in the place of greatest honor. His hands were steady. His eyes met hers. He stepped back and rendered a salute, not casual, not perfunctory, but the formal salute of one officer to another, of one warrior to another, of a man alive, because she had not hesitated when hesitation would have been convenient. Katie returned the salute. Her arm was straight. Her eyes were forward. And when she lowered her hand, the crowd applauded, the the sound of boots standing, of chairs scraping back, of human acknowledgement that some people spend their entire lives in service and ask for nothing in return. In that moment, in the October sunlight at San Diego Naval Base, Katie Morrison finally understood that the life she had chosen to hide did not diminish her. It defined her. The work she had done in the dark, both in Ramadi 20 years ago and in the ER at Mercy General, that work had never stopped mattering. The man who had tried to erase her was now selling insurance in a strip mall. The man she had saved was standing beside her in full military dress. And somewhere, Marcus, her husband, her anchor, the man who had loved her through Ramadi and the aftermath, Marcus would have been standing in the front row, weeping. That evening, she stood alone in her apartment in Pacific Beach, still wearing the dress uniform because she could not quite bring herself to take it off. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost did not answer. But muscle memory from 2 decades of military service made her pick it up. Senior Chief, a voice said. Female. Calm. Efficient. This is Captain Elena Vasquez, Commander of Naval Hospital San Diego. I am calling to offer you a position. Chief Medical Officer, Trauma Surgery. Salary, $143,000. Benefits. Full military pension restoration. We are building a new VA trauma wing, and the entire Navy would prefer that you build it. Vasquez paused. Sir, with respect, you have hidden long enough. Katie Morrison did not answer for a long time. She looked at her reflection in the apartment window. A woman in dress blues. A woman with medals. A woman who had spent 8 years trying to be invisible. I will take the position, she said finally. Excellent, Senior Chief. When can you start? Katie looked at the dress uniform. She thought about the medals. She thought about the ER at Mercy General, about the patients still arriving on stretchers, about the ones who still needed saving. Monday, she said. But Katie Morrison did not become Chief Medical Officer on Monday. Instead, she walked into Mercy General at 6:19 a.m., still in her military dress, and asked to speak with the new ER director. She walked out of that meeting 30 minutes later with a modified position, not administration, but clinical. Head trauma nurse. Mentor to new staff. Direct patient care, not bureaucracy. She put on scrubs. The dress uniform came off. The medals went into a shadow box. The stethoscope came around her neck. And when the first patient of the day arrived, a teenager with a compound arm fracture from a skateboarding accident, Katie Morrison moved forward with the same composure that had carried her through Ramadi, through PTSD, through being systematically destroyed by a man who never understood that some people cannot be broken because they have already survived their worst moment. She was placing in fall line when a nurse named Jennifer approached her quietly. I wanted you to know, Jennifer said, that I stood up to Dr. Sterling 3 times. Before he got fired. I reported him to the board. Katie's hands did not stop moving. The 20-gauge needle slid into the vein with the precision of muscle memory. Thank you, she said simply. It was the highest compliment she could have given. The trembling was not fear. It was restraint. The power to destroy and the choice not to. The power to humiliate and the choice to rise instead. The power to hide and finally the courage to emerge. Scars tell stories. Sometimes they tell stories about the people who tried to erase you. Sometimes they tell stories about who you became instead. And sometimes, the bravest warriors do not carry guns or wear insignia where everyone can see it. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes and wear scrubs and save lives in emergency departments where no one knows what they have survived. Subscribe for more stories of hidden valor revealed. Like this video if you believe that true strength is revealed in crisis, not circumstance. Comment below, what would you have done if you discovered your quiet coworker was a decorated military officer? The most thoughtful comments will be featured in the next video.